It's time now for perspective. And for our segment today, we're going to stay on the growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And for that, Sari Bashi joins us on the program from the West Bank. She's program director at Human Rights Watch and co-founder and former director of the Israeli human rights organization, Gisha, as well. Hi, Sari. Thank you for joining us today. So I know you've been asked this question a million times over the past several days, but since the situation is evolving every day quickly, can you just start by painting a picture of what the latest is coming from Gaza? What is life like? What are some of the most urgent situations that civilians there are facing?
It's a very important question, and thank you for it. So one of the most urgent needs is for the Israeli government to stop banning fuel from entering Gaza. Under the current circumstances, fuel is life-saving aid. Hospitals are running out of fuel to power generators in order to pump ventilators, power incubators in neonatal intensive care units, run operations and maintain basic sanitation, water systems, sewage pumping, aid delivery, ambulances all rely on fuel. Since October 7th, the Israeli military has not allowed any fuel into Gaza whatsoever, even though a trickle of aid is coming in via Rafah crossing. In addition, the Israeli government needs to immediately restore electricity and water fully to Gaza, which it cut on October 7th in an act of collective punishment against Gaza's civilians, and also open its own crossings into Gaza for truckloads of humanitarian aid, as it has done in previous hostilities.
We've heard the Israeli military say in recent days that people who are in the north will maybe not necessarily be considered as civilians, that they need to evacuate. But is anywhere safe? Palestinians were told to go to other parts in the south, but bombing is also continuing there. So what are people supposed to do?
So the Israeli military is weaponizing humanitarian provisions, provisions of the laws of war to protect civilians, misrepresenting them and weaponizing them to harm civilians. Several weeks ago, the Israeli military warned more than 1 million people in northern Gaza to evacuate to the south. Under ordinary circumstances, the laws of war encourage parties to warn civilians of impending attack, where such warnings allow them to keep themselves safe. But the Israeli military issued a warning to people where there was no safe place to go and no safe way to get there. Under those circumstances, the warning is not effective. And under all circumstances, civilians who stay behind, either because they cannot or will not leave evacuation zones, these are families facing impossible choices. Some people have been killed trying to use the designated evacuation routes that the Israeli military told them to use. Others have been killed while in southern Gaza. People who remain behind retain their civilian protections. They have to be protected. Instead, the Israeli government has warned civilians in northern Gaza that they risk being considered complicit in terrorism. It has completely blocked aid to the north and even admonished and criticized humanitarian organizations for providing aid to civilians in Gaza's north. There is no safe place in Gaza right now. All civilians must be protected, in particular people in Shifa Hospital, which is the main hospital in the north. These are ICU patients. These are doctors who cannot evacuate, and they need to be protected.
Israel continues to justify its strikes on civilian infrastructure by saying that Hamas is sheltering weapons or soldiers in these places, that Hamas ultimately is responsible for the deaths we're seeing in schools, hospitals, refugee camps. First, what do you make of these claims, and what does international law have to say about accepting clearly such high numbers of collateral damage in order to apparently reach military targets?
International law requires warring parties to protect civilians, full stop, and those obligations are non-reciprocal. They don't depend on whether the other side is keeping them. So Hamas and Islamic Jihad committed war crimes against Israeli civilians on October 7th by massacring and taking them hostage. And those are war crimes that have no justification. War crimes by Palestinian armed groups do not justify war crimes by the Israeli military against Palestinian civilians. In the past, Human Rights Watch has documented Palestinian armed groups failing to take adequate precautions to protect civilians by locating military personnel, weapons in civilian areas, though that is unlawful. If that is happening right now, that does not excuse the Israeli military from its obligations to protect civilians. This is another misrepresentation of international law that we're hearing from the Israeli military. Even if the other side is endangering civilians by operating from populated areas, you still have to protect civilians. We're very concerned about the way the Israeli military is interpreting proportionality. We've seen massive attacks on on targets that have killed many civilians, scores of civilians, justified by saying there was a military target. I can't say more than that because we haven't yet been able to do those investigations. What I can say is that the Israeli military's use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas significantly raises the risks of unlawfully indiscriminate attacks. There's a widely accepted norm that 83 countries have signed up for, including the US, including Palestine, saying armies should not drop missiles in densely packed city blocks, because if you do that, you are predicted to kill children. And since this began, the Israeli military has killed nearly 4,000 children in Gaza in less than a month. The Israeli military should stop dropping explosive weapons in densely populated areas that have wide area effects, because regardless of what you are targeting, you will kill large numbers of civilians. And the Israeli military has those obligations regardless of what Hamas and Islamic Jihad is doing. And Hamas and Islamic Jihad have obligations to stop firing rockets indiscriminately at Israeli communities, regardless of what the Israeli military is doing.
Sari, I'm sorry, we've just got time for one last question. I do want to ask you to what extent what we're seeing today is not in part linked to the fact that there's been so little movement on documenting the possible crimes in the past. The ICC's prosecutor's office has been investigating alleged crimes committed in Palestine since 2021. Why haven't these investigations moved forward in general? And why do you think we're seeing so little reactions from the international community with respect to what's happening today?
So why the ICC investigation has yet to produce visible results is an excellent question, and I hope you'll ask the ICC prosecutor that question. I am encouraged that recently the ICC prosecutor went to Rafah crossing, on the Egypt-Gaza crossing, and called for parties to obey the laws of war. That's a preventive statement that can be very important in these conflicts. We also hope and expect for arrest warrants to be issued, not just because of the current escalation, but because of the crimes against humanity and war crimes that have been committed for the past many years, both by Israel as well as by Palestinian armed groups. I'm very concerned about the role of the United States and other Western backers of the Israeli government who are not requiring the Israeli military to obey the laws of war. They need to insist that the crossings be opened for the full panoply of humanitarian aid, and that the Israeli military cease dropping explosive weapons in densely packed city blocks.
Sari Bashi, Human Rights Watch Program Director, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.